Welcome to A Fresh Face in Hell. I'm your host, Jonathan Evison. Every week we talk to someone new and interesting, somebody intellectually curious, somebody who will hopefully renew our faith in this cold, cruel world we live in. A Fresh Face in Hell. So in the 1970s, there was this psychologist, Julian Jaynes from Yale, and he developed a whole bunch of unique theories that question our fundamental beliefs in the evolution of human consciousness. And one of them, to me, the most fascinating one is his theory of what he calls the bicameral mind, which asks us to recontextualize everything we accept about human history and prehistory in terms of consciousness, how we thought. So suppose that at some point in human history, maybe as recently as the dawn of the Bronze Age, the right and left hemispheres of our brains were not as conversant as they are today, that the mind existed in Jaynes's bicameral state. Imagine what it would be like to not consciously utilize both sides of your brain at all times. You're basically operating on autopilot, not reflecting so much as acting on learned behaviors, like a border collie. According to Jaynes, ancient people experienced the world in a manner similar to this. Rather than making conscious evaluations in novel or unexpected situations, the person actually hallucinated voices or gods who gave them advice or commanded them to do things or admonished them, which the subject obeyed and acted upon without question. Sound familiar? The Old Testament, the Odyssey, pretty much the entire canon of ancient literature. The players in these stories take advice directly from God. They never, I can't think of a single example where they ever reason for themselves. They're always doing as the voice of God tells them. Jaynes submitted that this was because the individual was not conscious of one's own thought processes as we are today, that the hemispheres of the brain were not tracking fluidly, that what we think of now as conscious reflection had not yet evolved into a self-aware state. Again, we're kind of on autopilot. We still do it all the time, driving our cars. There's a million things every day. We can basically get through a whole day if we're not thoughtful in this state. This would explain a lot about our ancient body of literature, both religious and secular. Why don't God speak directly to us anymore? Why don't we hear voices unless we're schizophrenic? Today's episode is pretty heady stuff, and I'm probably in the way some of the time with my, goofy, curious questions. But I would ask that you stick with today's guest because it's actually really fascinating stuff, and you will be rewarded. Because today we're going to talk to Brian McVeigh, who's a PhD in anthropology from Princeton, who, inspired by the theoretical framework of the aforementioned Julian Jaynes, the guy's published 16 books on everything from the history of Japanese psychology to the origins of religions. He's written a book about the Bible, about spirit possession, about art, about popular culture, linguistics, nationalism, the changing definitions of self, time, and space. This guy's done a lot of writing. He's a smart dude. Please welcome to the show, Brian McVeigh. So, Brian, if you would, walk us through Jaynes' conception of the bicameral mind.
So his idea was that, and by the way, this is based on a lot of evidence. It wasn't something like he just dreamt this up. This was something that he devoted his life to understand. The original question was consciousness, and that led him to the bicameral mind. And basically, the idea is that the human brain has two parts, the right hemisphere, left hemisphere. And he always wondered why the right hemisphere, though it had some function, seemed to be almost a vestige. We weren't sure what it was doing, especially when you looked at linguistic production. And so he, it's sort of a long, complicated story. I won't go into it because there were many twists and turns, but basically it had to do with hallucinations. And he wondered why it seemed that about 3,000 years ago, so many people were having hallucinations. And as I said, it all came together in his mind. And the idea is that, well, what was happening is that there was a different type of communication between the hemispheres when it came to language. And that when people were under stress or they needed instructions, they would receive commands or orders from what were believed to be the gods. But the tricky thing about Jaynes, that I just want to throw this in there because there's a lot of misunderstanding. When people read or hear about Jaynes, they assume that he is offering a neurological model for how the mind works. But actually, it's more complicated than that. Of course, there is a neurological grounding to the mind, but the major contribution of Jaynes is that he talked about how, or he showed how it's culture, specifically language, that shapes this idea of consciousness. And again, not to get ahead of ourselves, but the problem is one of these terms, namely consciousness. That is very misleading for a lot of people who try to understand Jaynes. And in his book, of course, he's very careful. He's very specific what he means by the word consciousness. And he claims, and I think, and I've done a lot of research on my own on this, if you look at the written word, well, if you look at text before 3,000 years ago, it isn't really clear that people had what we would call consciousness. There's no linguistic evidence. They, of course, talked about a lot of other things, but they were not recording or talking about what we would call subjective, introspectable experiences. And again, just to repeat, this word consciousness, I think, can be very confusing for people because it's used in pop scientific literature all the time. They're doing research on this part of the brain, that part of the brain, and they discovered what consciousness is or where consciousness is located in the brain. But of course, that to me is very misleading. And consciousness does not mean perception. It does not mean thinking. It means a certain type of awareness, a sense of subjectivity that only humans have.
Like the ego.
Yes, the ego.
For instance, like more like ego thinking versus, because there's a lot of, I don't want to say precognitive, but sort of unconscious or, you couldn't say preconscious, but we do a lot of stuff on auto drive,
Yes.
almost instinctually. Driving a car or, just things we don't even have to think about just because of repetition. So yeah, that's one of the things that's, I think, important for people to understand is we're not talking about suddenly, Jaynes isn't just talking about suddenly people could have thoughts like they were just walking around like, gorillas before or whatever. And now so is Jaynes, technically speaking, is the theory of the bicameral mind, is this a theory or is a hypothesis? Is it scientifically defensible? Has this been tested, and what were those tests?
Right. So that's a really important question. And Jaynes came up with 4 hypotheses. And his book, actually, there's a lot of evidence in his book, but the way he viewed his book, he viewed it as sort of a map or an agenda. And like I said, there were 4 hypotheses. One had to do with when consciousness emerged. The second hypothesis had to do with the nature of consciousness, that consciousness is not something genetic, it's not something inborn, it's something culturally acquired. The other hypothesis has to do with the neurology of the bicameral mind. And then the 4th hypothesis has to do with dating. The what century, what period did consciousness start to emerge? So again, I know that's a lot there, but those are 4 hypotheses. And I think the important part of your question, is there evidence for this? I definitely think that there is. I've written a lot of books on this. I've done a lot of research. And what I've done is I've taken each hypothesis and I've broken them down into sub-hypotheses and looked for the evidence. And that's what real science is. There's one hypothesis that I have not really done any work on, and that's the neurological aspect of the bicameral mind, because I'm not qualified to do that. I'm not a neurologist. But the other hypotheses, I think, are a lot easier to demonstrate. And by the way, even the neurological hypothesis, there is a lot of evidence on that.
So Jaynes submits that he believed, I believe, if I'm right here, that he believes that this higher consciousness, this arose around the Bronze Age collapse, which would be around 1200 BC. That's the collapse of Egypt, the Hittites, the Syrians, all these empires. How is the emergence of this consciousness related to these collapses, or is this just coincidence? Or
I think it's definitely not coincidence. And I think what happened, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of theorizing on what led to the late Bronze Age collapse? It was probably a number of things, but one thing I think is that, to put it simply, these civilizations at the time simply got too big. The populations were too large. The elite simply couldn't keep track of what was going on. There were a lot of pressures. And so one of the reasons for this collapse of civilizations was the fact that the bicameral mind was not up to the job. The bicameral mind was very effective for small-scale agricultural city-states. But beyond that, as societies, as states started to grow larger, the populations became bigger, the economics became more complex, the bicameral mind could not handle that complexity. The voices of the gods got too tangled up. It's sort of like a communication network. That's what the mind is, really, a communication network. And when there are too many things going on, it leads to chaos. And that led to, that was one of the reasons why you had Bronze Age collapse. And what replaced the bicameral mind, of course, was this idea of consciousness, or just to be clear, I like to use the term Jaynesian consciousness, so people understand that we're not talking about thinking or cognition or perception. We're talking about a particular type of cognition, a highly specialized type of cognition that is based on language, that is not genetically, that's not something that we're genetically born with.
And so this allows the hemispheres, once we've crossed this threshold, the hemispheres for the first time can communicate with one another instead of operating as two separate entities. Which
Right.
I remember he used to, he talked about the Iliad. He talked about biblical texts in terms of like, these people are never making cognitive decisions on their own. They're always being spoken to by the gods. God told Moses this, or, I mean, and this is prevalent in all world religions. And so dive into that a little bit for me.
Yeah. So this is a very important point, because we have become so used to assuming that all peoples were religious thousands of years ago, and no one ever asked the question, well, why is it that it was not until a certain period, about 1000 BCE, give or take 2 or 3 centuries, that people started to ask really hard questions. People started to doubt the gods. Before that time, no one doubted the gods. And so we have to really reevaluate the role of religion in human history and look at it as presenting evidence that people did have a completely different mentality before about 1000 BCE. And you mentioned the Bible. The Bible is a wonderful text, because basically what the Bible is about, it's writings that indicate how people were longing for an earlier mentality, a bicameral mentality, when God or the gods directly spoke to people. And when that started to collapse, of course, it led to all sort of different developments that you see in the Bible. So the Bible really is a sort of a narrative, a chronology of change in human mentality. Most of the books of the Bible were written about the 5th or 6th century BCE. However, many of those books are referring back to an earlier time. They had this nostalgic sense that Yahweh used to walk among people and talk directly to people. And of course, that had been lost. But this is what the early Hebrews were longing for, and you see that reflected in their writing. And by the time you get to, of course, the New Testament, people are living with a completely different mentality. And Jesus really spoke to a different mentality. Jesus was about this idea that the kingdom of heaven is within, that the kingdom of heaven is not necessarily a literal place, that the kingdom of heaven is more of an interior space within a person's soul.
And the New Testament asks for more accountability on a personal level, not just the threat of, being struck by lightning or whatever.
Yes.
So, I mean, in a way, is it safe to say that if the hemispheres of the mind are integrated for the first time, and I know this sounds kind of crazy to people because the timeline sounds so tight, but, we still thought the earth was flat 400 years ago. The psychological utility of believing in God sort of loses some of its cachet, right?
That's true. So And by the way, when we talk about the hemispheres being integrated, even during bicameral times, the hemispheres were integrated, but in a very different way. But to get back to what you just said, what's interesting, what I think is overlooked by many scholars, it's actually quite startling that before about the 12th century BCE, there's no what we might call, for lack of a better term, philosophy. What I mean by that, there's no questioning of the God's existence. No one, the people sometimes argue with the gods, they get upset with the gods, but no one says, hey, wait a minute, maybe the gods are a human invention. That does not come until much later. And to me, in certain parts of the world, for example, Mesopotamia, from about 3,500, 3,000 BCE to about 1,000 BCE, you're talking a couple thousand years there. Why is there no skepticism? There's no questioning of the gods. And I think the reason is because these people had a very different psychology, where questioning the existence of the gods was just culturally impossible.
Because, according to the theory, you're hearing these voices that must be coming from without because the person is not consciously thinking of them. Now, what I'm wondering is how did culture evolve that far? If, how does this work in societal terms? How do you discern all these mixed messages? If everybody's inner voice is a God, how does a society achieve any kind of continuity? Whose voice becomes the authority? If my God's telling me this, listen, I spent a lot of time with paranoid schizophrenics in my caregiving days, and if everybody's hearing a voice and there's no discernible pattern, it isn't that chaos, and maybe isn't that why? That would sort of speak to the need to integrate those two hemispheres.
Yes, so that's a good point that you bring up, because on the surface it does seem quite a claim, as you seem to be suggesting. Well, how come people, you would assume people are maybe hearing different voices of the gods, and so this would lead to chaos. But there's a couple things we have to keep in mind. One thing is that most of the time, people probably were not hearing voices. Most of the time, people were behaving the way that we behave. When we drive a car, for example, a lot of our actions are non-conscious. We're not even thinking about things. And so the voices only made an appearance when there was a problem, when something was unclear to somebody. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Then the other thing is people did not necessarily have to hear the same voices. What's important is that at some psychic level, people assumed other people were hearing the same voices. People assumed that everyone was on the same page. I think one way to look at it, if Martians or an alien race study human psychology in conscious times, in modern times, they would say, oh, it doesn't make any sense because everyone has a different interior life. Everyone is using their mind's eye to see something different all the time. So how come human society can still function? How come it's still integrated? How come it still works? Well, because we don't necessarily have to be seeing, quote, the same thing with our mind's eye all the time. What's important is that we assume that people are having, in general, the same experiences. So I think it's the same thing in the pre-conscious bicameral, in bicameral period. People made the assumption that everyone is hearing the same voices. And, but I should add to that, there was chaos. There are, if you look at the historical record, if you look at the Bible, for example, there's a lot of confusion. There's about, in certain instances, who's talking to who? Is this God? Is this an angel? Is God talking to this person, that person? So the lines of communication were often tangled. It did lead to problems. And eventually things got so bad that it led to the collapse of civilizations during the late Bronze Age collapse.
So if I'm following you here, basically until human societies until we moved away from the agrarian cultures, until societies became complex enough that we needed all of this infrastructure to support a larger population, we didn't really need the right brain as much. We could function much as primates do in terms of just learned behaviors. This is how we function on a daily basis. Not a lot of deep thinking going on, but we can perform tasks. I think that's what a lot of people are going to find confusing about this, is that, again, that word consciousness, they're going to think what Jaynes is saying is that, like, we just couldn't think before that.
Right.
I feel like you can walk around and not think abstractly and get along just fine in this world. You're probably not going to produce any groundbreaking art, but I mean, you could basically function. Am I right?
I think so. I mean, we have to keep in mind that in ancient civilizations, they did, even in pre-conscious times, they did engage in some pretty sophisticated abstract thought. I mean, they built the pyramids. They utilized sophisticated mathematics. They did all types of things. But what I think a better way to look at what you're talking about, it's not so much a matter of abstract thought. I think there's another important concept here that Jaynes talked about. He did not theorize on it much, but it relates to politics and this idea that the word that he used is authorization. And the bicameral mind was about being authorized to do or to think certain things. And I think in the modern, postmodern world, what happens, how do we explain dictators not just getting power, but staying in power? And I think a lot of it has to do with they want a single line of communication, of authorization. They don't want complexity. They're afraid of change. They're afraid of social transition. They're afraid of something that's different or alien. And the easiest thing to do is just say, I'm only going to get my instructions from one God or from one person, from one personage, and it starts to become cult-like. And that, of course, can lead to a lot of problems.
So when we talk about hemispheres of the brain not communicating fluidly, I mean, my mind goes right to schizophrenia and psychosis. And, behavioral neuroscientists have talked about psychosis as being actually a group of symptoms that tend to surface in early adulthood when we're trying to figure out who we are and what we want to do. Now, if you take this statement and sort of apply it to the evolution of culture, like pre-Bronze Age cultures maybe being at a point of sort of adolescent in their development, is that making any sense to you in terms of a
It could in certain ways.
utility?
Yeah. I think the challenge comes when societies start to become very complex. And if you look at Bronze Age civilizations, even though they were very sophisticated in many ways, in some ways, people had all the answers on and their little universe on how to do things. Society was very predictable. There all types of rituals and ceremonies that they just followed. And that's fine. But what happens if you're being invaded, or if there's an epidemic or some natural catastrophe, or this is more insidious, but when populations start to get too big and the needs of people become varied, then you're going to lead to, then that's going to cause stresses. And oftentimes cultures can evolve, they can adapt if they're given enough time. But in other situations, if they're not given, it's not just a matter of technology that saves us, it's a matter of culture, of having the proper language to process all this change. It's a matter of having a sophisticated language that we can use to not interpret just our own behaviors, our own feelings, but the behaviors of other people. So I think this is a slightly different topic, but one thing that's important, I think, when it comes to psychological disorders is, does the person have the language to express their emotions? Do they have the language to talk about what is threatening them or how they're feeling? Is there nuance there? And that's why if you look at the glossaries of ancient languages. When I say ancient languages, I'm going way back. I'm talking Bronze Age. They don't really have a lot of psychological terminology because they didn't need it. But now in the postmodern world, people are very complicated beings, and we need a much more sophisticated language in order to interpret our own sentiments and the thoughts and feelings of others.
So what we're talking about here, essentially, is kind of a natural selection, right? I mean, moving from a bicameral mind to an integrated mind. Does Jaynes, does he hypothesize how long this transition took? Or because it seems like pretty fast, right? Because usually we're talking about natural selections and evolutionary changes, just the growth of the jaw or something like that, or
Right.
the things like that. We're talking about huge periods of time, and here we're talking about centuries.
Yes. So what's important to keep in mind, when we use the word evolution, it can be used in to talk about genetic changes in the natural world, or we can use evolution to talk about social, cultural changes. And those two types of evolution are very different. I mean, one is based on genetics, the other is based on learning things. So
culture accelerates. We know that. I mean, we just look how technology is accelerated. It took, how long, thousands of years to get to the Industrial Revolution. And then since that time, look what we've done in 150 years. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right.
I mean, it's exponential.
Oh, yes. And in fact, I can't quote prove this, but it seems to me that history is speeding up, and it seems to be speeding up faster and faster, especially since the 18th, 19th centuries. And a lot of that has to do with technology. Who knows where we're going to go? It's actually quite disorienting when you stop and think about it. But, it doesn't take much for a culture to change, and it doesn't necessarily take a long time for a culture to change. So probably the seeds of Jaynesian consciousness were already there in bicameral civilizations. So I'm talking about maybe 2000, 1500 BCE. Changes were already occurring. And Jaynes doesn't go into this too much, but in his book, he does suggest that there were many societies that were partially bicameral and partially conscious. That's not a either-or thing. And you can make that argument today, I think, there are a lot of vestiges of the bicameral mentality, such as hypnosis and schizophrenia. So it's not an either-or thing.
So then the ego, basically, we're kind of talking about it in terms of the ego. The ego sort of happens once the hemispheres are working continuously. This was what we would call the emergence of the ego, and the ego, of course, is that function that purposely directs our thoughts and actions, but also inhibits our actions. It's a sort of the ego controls impulsive behavior.
Right. It can short circuit a behavior, and so it depends. You can use the word ego, or you could use a word that I would just use the word self. Because the ego sometimes can also have certain connotations, but certainly a type of individualization of the person occurred where the individual was taken as an important unit of society. And of course, especially in postmodern times, I mean, that's what it's all about, the individual, no matter what society you go to. And that is a sort of a major global development, this idea that each person counts because within their mind, they have this incredible, the word that Jaynes uses is introcosm. So we're talking about not just a macrocosm or a microcosm, these ancient ways of looking at the world. We're talking about an introcosm, something that exists within the person. And that what happens is we have more needs as humans. In a sense, human nature is becoming more and more complex, not because of genetic evolution so much, but because of cultural evolution.
Okay. Now, people are going to say, a lot of people, I mean, I had this kind of knee-jerk reaction, and I think a lot of people are. So we're talking about Jaynes is sort of talking about gods almost in this pre-Bronze Age period, almost as if they're parts of the nervous system. Like the examples we touched upon the Bible, God talking to Moses, and how in the characters of the Iliad are only compelled to action by the voices of God. Nobody ever says, nobody makes a decision on their own without the gods directing them. People are going to argue that, how do we know this is just not a poetic device? What did Jaynes have to say about that? What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an important question. So the reason why Jaynes would say that it's not just a poetic device is because if you look at global history, global religious history, there are these huge patterns. You can trace a trajectory in all civilizations. They all start out, the term that I use is super religious, where the gods are everywhere. There's no modern definition of politics. Science seems stuck in a certain era. And these people, by today's standards, seem to be obsessed with the gods. And not just gods, by the way, but their ancestors that they communicate with and spirits and what have you. And so the question is, what's going on here? How come we cannot find to date an ancient civilization that was not super religious? So there's definite patterns there, and you see this in all religious literature. And you see a sort of an evolution that the gods over time become less important. They're sort of pushed aside, and religion undergoes these changes. You see this in India. Of course, the best example in terms of a written text is among the Jews with the change from the Old Testament to the New Testament. No matter where in Egypt, you see the same changes. So that's what we have to pay attention to. And the only way to really appreciate Jaynes, I think, is to stand back and look at these major patterns. And then it's not so convincing, at least to me, to say, well, this is just a poetic device. People used those poetic devices once they were conscious, but originally they were not just poetic devices. People actually had these experiences, what we would call hallucinatory experiences, where they would have the gods or the ancestors communicate with them.
It is interesting. I wonder if somebody could produce an exception to what we're talking about here as kind of a blanket thing, which is that nobody was really philosophical before 1200 BC in an individual sort of like, this is my individual experience in the universe. I wonder if somebody can't find, because when you talk about it in these blanket terms, you're right. I'm just thinking about in terms of larger cultural movements, I'm not, it's kind of true that people are talking to gods and God is providing the guidance in the philosophy. Schizophrenics basically operate with a bicameral mind. Have you obviously you've heard of the schizophrenia simulators, where basically they put an earplug in your right ear and you just hear this voice all day long, and you're supposed to go through your normal life, solve problems and everything, but the whole time you're hearing this voice, often critical, which again, we're in the realm of ego, superego, like you're not good enough. Don't do that. That's a stupid thing to do. All day long, this thing is incessantly, this is what these schizophrenic simulators do. They're just all day long, just self-critical. Don't do that. But you're hearing the voices out loud in your ear, and you're supposed to it gets in the way of doing simple mathematical equations. All of a sudden, you can't do long division because you got this voice in your brain. I don't know. Help me out here. Is the schizophrenic sort of the modern? Is this what happened to people that didn't evolve to the bicameral or past the bicameral mind? I don't know that much about schizophrenia.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's important to keep in mind about schizophrenia is that people who suffer from schizophrenia are still conscious. It's just that a vestige of the bicameral mind has erupted into their psychological system. And of course, that can be very, needless to say, very disorienting. And, people who did not adapt fast enough during the transition from bicamerality into conscious mentality, there's evidence that sometimes they were just killed off. That there's evidence of that, for example, in the Bible. But I think overall, people probably were given enough time to adapt and to learn the language of consciousness. And basically, that's the important thing to keep in mind: how consciousness came to be. It came to be through language, and Jaynes spent a lot of time talking about this. It's almost sort of it's not necessarily a linguistic deterministic argument that language caused consciousness, but certain words allowed for the architecture of consciousness to emerge. And that's why, as I said before, if you look at glossaries of ancient languages going back to the Bronze Age, their psychological vocabulary, or what we might call mind words, was very, very limited. They did not have a lot of words for thinking or mind. They certainly had no abstract notion of mind or thinking. And so to me, that's a key piece of evidence that consciousness is something that is rooted not in neurology per se, though you need, of course, a brain. Consciousness really is rooted in linguistics, in a certain type of language.
So is this is pretty heady stuff. So are we saying that is language the bridge between the hemispheres? Because I've heard that, I know that 1% of people in their lifetime will be diagnosed with some sort of psychotic disorder, and also I've noticed that crystal meth seems to isolate people's hemispheres, so that speaks to maybe some sort of chemical trigger. But like, is what you're saying that is the language that helps integrate the hemispheres? I don't.
Well, yeah, I think you could make that argument. Like I said, even for a bicameral individual, the hemispheres to some degree are going to be integrated. It's just that they're integrated in a very different way. And in the bicameral mind, the culture has taught it sounds strange to put it this way, but culture has socialized the right hemisphere to communicate as if it were God to the left hemisphere. But then when consciousness evolved, that system broke down because of social complexity, and a new type of language, you might call it a conscious language, a language that was filled with words that referred to what was going on inside a person. And you can trace this out, actually, and Jaynes does that in his book, Looking at Ancient Greek. You can trace this evolution of a language, going from a language that lacked psychological words or a psychological vocabulary, then changing into a new type of language that possessed words that, again, for lack of a better term, you might call them mental words or psychological vocabulary.
Okay, so help me out with some, let's think of some examples of these terms. Like,
well, for example, it could be any word that describes emotions, anger, hatred, happiness. I mean, ancient languages had those words, but they were very, very limited. They lacked nuance. The word to the more abstract words, such as mind or mentality, certainly did not exist. It's very different. It's very difficult to talk about the mind in a scientific abstract sense if you don't have a word for mind. And I think a concrete way to understand this is this idea, how language taught people to believe that there is a space inside their heart or inside their head. We don't take that literally, but it's a very useful way to communicate, to use our heart or any other organ as a metaphoric expression to talk about how I feel. If you look at psychological words in modern language, they can almost always be traced to an earlier language that was very colorful and very metaphoric, that was based on inner organs. Of course, that you see that in all languages. That's why we refer to the heart a lot when we talk about psychology. And so, it's a strange concept, but the idea that Jaynes is proposing is that people could not. There's no dualism of what's going on inside my mind versus the outside world. That there's only the outside world. There's only an external reality. There's no there's no mind's eye, you might say, that can see something in my imaginary space in my head. So Jaynes uses the word spatialization, and spatialization is the belief that there are psychological processes happening inside me somewhere. In ancient civilizations, usually was in the heart. Sometimes it might be the stomach or the liver or the blood even. It was only recently that we started to think that psychological processes happen in the head, actually. But so I'm not sure if that's clear, but the idea is that it was language that created this belief that psychological events happen inside the person. They don't really happen inside anywhere, really, because psychological processes are information. They're not. That's a problem with neurology, I think. Neurology is always looking for some part of the brain where things are happening, but that's sort of a misattribution. It's not a good way to look at neurological events. Neurological events, strictly speaking, don't have a location. They have an effect in the real world. But in any case, it's important to pay attention to how language played a role in the development of modern consciousness.
It sounds like it's not a theory so much as a hypothesis. And if it's a theory, what testing did Jaynes or have other people in the field conducted? I mean, is there examples of experiments that have, put a finer point on these propositions? Right. Or
yes. So in the world of neurology, and as I said, I can't really speak about neurology. I'm not trained in that field, but I know there have been a number of neurological studies that support what Jaynes had argued. And you can find these on, if you go to the Julian Jaynes website, these studies are listed. And also in my own work, I've published about maybe a dozen books or so. And what I do is I try and test Jaynes' hypotheses. As I said, I've looked at the Old Testament and New Testament in one of my books. In another book, I looked at ancient Egypt to see the transition from bicameral to the conscious mind. I've looked at, in my other works, I've looked at changes in world religions. So, and in my writings, I try to be as scientific as possible. I'm not just defending Jaynes. I'm giving examples of how his theories explain a lot of evidence that up to now really has been, has not been well integrated. And also, with Jaynes talked not just, if you want to appreciate what Jaynes was saying, it's not just about changes from looking at changes in ancient civilizations. It's also about vestiges of the bicameral mind that we see all around us. And Jaynes spent a lot of time, of course, schizophrenia has a whole chapter on that in his book, but also hypnosis. We know a lot about hypnosis, but it's not supposed to happen. What's going on there? So Jaynes, the beauty of Jaynes is he looks at spirit possession, glossolalia, channeling, all these things, and he integrates them into one nice theory. Up to now, that's never been done. People just sort of don't really have a theory that ties everything together. That's why some people, proponents of Jaynes, have called him the Darwin of psychology, because he has brought so many of these things under one theoretical umbrella and tied it all up very neatly. And also hallucinations, for example. No one doubts the existence of hallucinations, but there's really they're not supposed to happen. Why are they happening? What's going on there? It's not enough to say, oh, it's just loose neurological wiring in a brain. We need a more robust theory to account for hallucinations. And things like, as I said, spirit possession.
Well, you talked about channeling, and an example from my own life. I've written 20 novels, okay? Um, I often talk, I finally got good at it. 10 of them weren't very good. I was, you could smell the coffee on my breath. And I was thinking, I was like, what happens next? But when the work is going good, I talk about just getting out of my own way, getting this sort of logical, like I have my outline and I have my idea of what's supposed to happen and what decisions characters have to make. And I might be trying to move my characters around like pawns on a chessboard with this sort of critical side of my mind. But when the work's going good, it's like subconscious, preconscious. I write myself into my best passages. The kind of like they say in science, how, accidents have produced some of the greatest results. This is what happens to me during the course of my work. I've learned to, trust the process, and that means to trust my unconscious mind. It leads me to places that I can't figure out in an outline. It sort of, and so there's something there. There is something there leading me, and I'm telling you, hours go by. I'm not saying channeling. I'm not hearing a God's voice dictated to me. It's not exactly that, but hours go by, hours and minutes. You know what I mean? It's like when I'm in the work, time never goes. It's the antithesis of standing in the DMV line. So. Does this idea of trusting the subconscious, like the subconscious knowing, in a way being wiser than the conscious mind, does this fit anywhere within the Jaynes paradigm?
I think it does. There are a lot of things you could say in relation to this. For one thing, for all its utility, consciousness can get in the way. Consciousness does not necessarily help us solve problems, and that's why maybe you've heard this. There's a saying. I think it came out of England among their scientists. Discoveries happen in the bed, bath, and bus. While you're not really thinking about anything, a solution to a problem will occur. The more you try to figure something out.
Me with walking my dog. That's exactly what I take a break in the middle of my writing day, and I walk the dog about 5 miles, and I come back and I crack the code.
That's right, and that's why, with hypnosis, why people are able to do some interesting, incredible things while they're hypnotized, because consciousness has been temporarily suppressed, and so they lose inhibition. They lose their fear, as it were. And so this is think about trying to ride a bike and try to be conscious of everything you do. There's no way you could do that. So years ago, I used to practice judo, and anytime I would throw someone, I wouldn't be thinking about it. My body would just take over, or my unconscious would take over, and would just know at that moment, this is when I should put my foot here, put my arm here, push back on the shoulder, whatever, and boom, my opponent would be on the mat. If I consciously tried to think of every move, there's no way I could defeat my opponent. So there are many examples. But when you think about typing, for example, you can't.
George Will called this equipoise when he was talking about athletes, like hitting a baseball. There's so many things to be thinking about while you're up there. Shifting your weight, keeping your elbow down, keeping your weight on your back foot. All this stuff, but you can't. When hitters are slumping, they're getting mental. They're thinking about it. When hitters are hitting well, they don't think about it. All these things are seamlessly operating in a sort of precognitive way, and he called that equipoise, which I think is a cool a way of putting what you're saying about the judo. I have to ask you, because we talk about Jaynes. I think that Jaynes's hypothesis has been a lot more influential than people realize, in terms of let's talk about the effect of the influence it's had on our culture since the 1970s. A recent example being Westworld, which very much deals with the bicameral mind, correct?
Yes. And I can't think of some other examples in literature that Jaynes has had an impact, but he has. Not as well known perhaps as Westworld, but
We'll talk about Westworld a little bit.
Yeah, actually, I wrote something on that. It's just a very short book. It's up on Amazon if anyone's interested. And it's actually I think the character played by Anthony Hopkins, I think he says that actually the bicameral mind has been disproven, which I don't agree with. But in any case, this is Westworld is like a lot of sci-fi. The question is really, can humans create consciousness? And, my feeling on that is that, well, probably not. We can certainly create machines, AI that mimic consciousness, or that look like and act like, quote, they're conscious. But I think it's philosophically, it's kind of a challenging proposition to make. But Westworld, I thought, was very exciting because it shed light on a lot of these issues. And that seems to be a common theme in sci-fi, actually.
Well, it's a fascinating conceit, if nothing else. And that's what I would say about all of this, because there's going to be a lot of people who are skeptical of this hypothesis of the bicameral mind, but what they cannot say is that it's not fascinating. And it doesn't make you seriously recontextualize maybe what your thoughts are, whether or not you believe it one way or another. So I want to thank you for walking us through this today. He is Brian McVeigh. He is an expert on the theories of Julian Jaynes and the bicameral mind. I'm going to close by asking you one question. Assuming the veracity of the bicameral mind, for the sake of argument here, what does the world look like today? Sorry to lie, this is a big one for you. What does the world look like today had we not evolved past the bicameral mind to integrate the hemispheres? What might a world with, how many billions of people we have now, what might that look like?
Yeah, that is a big question. It's funny you should say that because I'm actually writing a novel that sort of answers that question. And it's not a pretty world. It's very dystopian. And basically what happens is you have a very small elite that did somehow evolve to become conscious, but they're in charge of everybody else who are not conscious. And they control people by letting the people believe that they're hearing the voices of gods. And so that, that certainly is within the realm of possibility, where you have one very smart group of people. Maybe they settled Mars or something, and they decide that we want people under our thumb. We want people...
It's starting to sound like the billionaires, except for the smart part. I sort of like your model because at least they have some evolutionary advantage instead of just money.
Right. Yeah.
And when I'm talking about those people out in front of Safeway, I'm like, they think they're hearing a god as far as I can tell. I don't know, man.
It is. So this is, just let me throw that in. I do think that I'm shocked that we are returning to this sort of almost a vestige of the bicameral mind, where people want simple answers from one leader and they're not willing to listen to their own voices and to question what they're hearing. So there are serious implications about this, about what Jaynes had to say about human psychology and how it relates to politics.
Ugh, it's a troubling thought. Thank you, Brian, so much for joining us today. He is Brian McVeigh. Find him on Amazon or wherever books are sold. He is the author of 16 books. Not most of them are, a large part of them, informed by the work of Julian Jaynes, that structural construct anyway. We really appreciate you joining us today, Brian. Thanks, man.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed myself.
A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison is brought to you by Fresh Face Pods and produced by Jason Botkin and yours truly. Check us out on Instagram, YouTube, or at our website at freshfacepods.tv. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter for updates and special content. And if you love the podcast, by all means, run out and buy all of Jonathan Evison's award-winning novels wherever books are sold.